Well, there's so much going on at the moment, it's hard to keep up almost. This was the scene from the Daily Echo capturing Milburn Road in Southampton last night, thanks to very heavy potential, very heavy rainfall actually moving through the southern half of the UK last night, courtesy of the latest area of low pressure that swept through. So we've had yet more flooding, and when you've got a saturated ground, it doesn't take an awful lot of rain to cause further problems. Meanwhile, up in Scandinavia, this has been the scene in parts of Sweden. So we know what's going on up in Scandinavia. The coldest temperature of this century so far in all of Scandinavia, courtesy of a temperature of minus 44.3 Celsius, I think it was. And there has been no temperature colder than that since the turn of the century. And we have got that world of cold knocking on the UK door. In fact, it's just sitting on the other side of the North Sea. But stunning scenes, Arctic like scenes across much of Scandinavia at the moment. And we are going to continue to see bitterly cold conditions prevail. So, where do we stand? This is the temperature anomalies for the front running 5 days of January, and I think it's safe to say that the core of coldest air anywhere on the planet compared to average is centered bang slap over Scandinavia and northwestern Russia, and you've got that kind of belt of cold and average extending all the way across northern Russia. But you notice here the amount of warmth within the high latitudes also here. The mid to high latitudes of the northern hemisphere is running quite warm compared to average. The UK is running warmer than average also, but we are about to see a change taking place. How cold will it get remains to be seen. I'm not overly enthusiastic about the snow potential. This is not an overly conducive pattern for heavy snowfall in the UK, despite having a cold easterly wind developing during the second half of the weekend and particularly into the first half of next week. But this is remarkable contrast. This is a remarkable front running 5 days with temperatures 15 to nearly 20 Celsius below average for the first 5 days of the month. For a 5 day anomaly close to 20 below is pretty impressive stuff. But you can see here the UK and Ireland here firmly warmer than average, and the central and southern half of Europe is also firmly above average. In fact, the core of the warmest conditions down into the Balkan region, Turkey, Greece. But look at the contrast here between the bitterly cold air and the unusually warm air, with the majority of Ukraine in the warm air, as you can see. But you get a few hundred miles to the north, and it's a different world altogether. Now, this is the latest run of the ECNWF for the next 30 days. So, this is the weeklies, this is the ensemble, and this is a 30-day period. And you can see here that we have bitterly cold conditions continue in Scandinavia into western Russia. But there's a big turnaround taking place across the rest of the continent, including the UK and Ireland here. And we'll look at that in just a second or so here. Snow prospects, like I say, not overly enthusiastic feeling about the snow prospects. I want to show you accurate analysis here, not hype, but exactly what I think is going to happen. Do we see a pull back of the cold, by the way? Despite the fact that we've yet to see it arrive on our doorstep, I think with the MJO we need to watch very carefully. Does it sneak back into phases 4 and 5 and then reintroduces a milder pattern? Now, I think there's going to be a bit of a back and forth with this cold spell coming up next week. I do think we see some reasonably significant cold mid-month. The question is, do we see a pullback in that cold during the second half of January? That is going to be the question, and I wouldn't be overly surprised if we do see that. But this is the overall total snowfall expected by the GFS model between now and the Thursday, the 18th of January. And you can see that it has very little snow across the bulk of England and Wales away from northern England, parts of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and much of Scotland, mainly over high ground, may I add, has snow to come. But with the type of pattern, remember what was explained yesterday, how this pattern evolves. We're going to see high pressure building, replacing that low pressure over the UK and Ireland this upcoming weekend. That will then strengthen over the northern UK into the early portions of next week. And this is the latest run of the UKV model, by the way, indicating the 850 temperatures. Now, what we have got is we've got less cold underneath the centre of that high. So as we play through this loop, you can see here that we cool things down at 850 over the northern UK, a little less so across the southern UK. This is as we progress through the day on Saturday. You notice here the colder air is now starting to kind of infiltrate into the UK, especially into England, eastern England, off the North Sea. Remember the world of cold that we've got centred very close by over Scandinavia, including Denmark, and into even northern portions of the Netherlands and Germany. But watch what happens as we progress into the latter half of Saturday and into Sunday in particular. Notice here how cold the 850s get into the eastern side of the southern UK. The reason why that is because we're underneath the centre of that blocking area of high pressure, not that far to the north of the UK here. So we've actually got temperatures close to the 0 Celsius at 850, not that far to the northwest of the Isle of Lewis here. Meanwhile, we've got -8, -9, and then as we progress through the course of Tuesday, you can actually see 850s of -12, possibly even -13. So that is courtesy of this. So this is the latest run of the GFS ensemble, and you can see here that low pressure firmly in control. We've got another cold area of low pressure near the southern portions of the Baltic Sea here. We've had tremendous amounts of snow in parts of southern Norway, by the way, as well, as Atlantic air meets bitterly cold Arctic air. But notice here, as we run through this 500 millibar geopotential height anomaly chart, note the height rises across the northern half of the UK, extending into Scandinavia. Now, at 850 millibars, we're actually going to warm the column up at that level over Scandinavia. But remember, we've got actually the coldest air within the atmosphere down at the surface. These 850 temperatures are not at -40 like they are down at the surface, by the way. And what happens is this wheel of higher pressure that then builds over the northern half of the British Isles, extending between Greenland and Scandinavia, it's going to allow some of that cold air to then get pulled westwards underneath that strengthening area of high pressure and into the southern half of the UK. Hence why the 850s are not overly enthusiastic with cold across the northern UK, because that is actually a mild area, a relatively mild area of high pressure. But what it's doing is it's transporting that cold out of the cold source region and pulling it underneath the high into the bulk of England and Wales here. So I think actually by the time we reach the early portion of next week, it wouldn't surprise me if we're struggling to get much above freezing, sub-freezing wind chills throughout the course of the day, anywhere from York down to London, down towards Folkestone, etc., etc. And we may even see some wintry showers then moving in off the North Sea. So you can see the general emphasis being on this setup here. These are the 850 temperature anomalies, and you can see what I'm talking about here. So slightly warmer than average, northern Scotland, the Northern Isles, well below average, particularly across France and into the Bay of Biscay here. Southern portions of the UK below average, warmer than average further north here. So you get the overall emphasis in terms of the latter half of this week, through the weekend and into the next week. High pressure will become strong overhead. Now, in terms of conduciveness for snow production here, you can see that the dew points are above freezing at the moment, so not conducive for any snow. But as we progress through the next few days, through the weekend and into early next week, those dew points start to crash. You notice here the dew points of -10, -11 Celsius at the tops of the Cairngorms mean that we're going to have some fairly cold numbers here. But you can see, generally speaking, that those dew points are crashing into the -5 to -6 range, and then even lower than that as we move towards the latter half of Monday and into Tuesday. That means it's more conducive for any precipitation falling as snow. And speaking of snow, here is the precipitation and cloud uh, expected by the UKV model as we progress through the next few days here. I always have a habit of cutting off the south of England. Many people getting upset by that. Like I said, I do apologise for that. So I'll try and make sure that I include the southern coast of England and points across the southern UK. But you notice here that there is shower activity actually moving in from the west, from off the Atlantic over the next day or so here. But then as we move through the weekend, as the high builds to the north, we're then starting to see the air coming in from the east and northeast. This is not a true bona fide beasterly or beast from the east by any stretch, but it's generally speaking, you can see the amount of dry conditions actually associated with this area of high pressure, by the way, hence why we're not going to see a great deal of snow out of this particular scenario. But it's as we go further into the period here, we are going to see a little bit of a waxing and waning in terms of the cold. But remember the overall situation, as explained already, the high retrograding up towards Greenland and potentially opening the door to something even more significant later down the road. That is still on the table. How have I categorized the month of January in the forecast? I've said that a moderate, possibly fairly strong cold spell was expected during the mid portion of the month here. Remember the January forecast, the winter forecast actually had the cold during the first half of the month here, so there is a little bit of a discrepancy shown up. But as I've already highlighted time and time again, it's impossible weeks or months ahead to pinpoint a particular type of weather pattern. But I think the takeaway is that you can see the overall idea being there, and I think that's the important thing to take hold from all this. So, GFS ensemble, 2 meter temperature anomalies, upcoming 5 days, looks like this here. As we continue to progress through the period, this is the 6 to 10, still cold on average across the UK, Ireland, and Western Europe in general. And then you notice here that as we progress towards the periods 12th through the 17th of January, the cold actually becomes stronger across the northern half of the continent, including the UK and Ireland here. And the reason for that is if we look at the northern hemispheric view at the 500 millibar height anomaly chart, you can see what is taking place. Now let's get to the right chart and you can see exactly what I'm looking at here. Look at where the position of the high is. It's centered bang slap over the North Atlantic and Greenland here. We've got that ring of negatives underneath representing a firmly colder than average pattern here. This would certainly be an exciting pattern, a very firmly negative Arctic oscillation, North Atlantic oscillation setup, and we will just simply have to sit and wait and see what happens here. Will it 100% play off? No, there's no guarantee in forecast and meteorology, but you can see the overall idea being very much there. Here's the overview chart of the GFS. So low pressure and control at the moment here, but notice here how it just kind of almost gets squeezed out by that building area of high pressure with all the activity over the Western Atlantic. Deepening area of low pressure pumps the ridge over the eastern side of the Atlantic basin, and therefore we start to see that low pressure dissipate, higher pressure takes over. We are kind of connecting up the high over Scandinavia, so we have a bit of a pull of that cold air mass into the southern half of the UK, as explained already. And then as we progress into the early portions of next week, you notice here how the high recenters over the northern UK. That's a pretty strong high, by the way, at 1044 millibars. Now, the record for the strongest high here at the house is 1041 millibars. Be interesting to see, actually, if we get close to the 1044 that the GFS expects to see early next week. Now, this is the middle portion of next week. Notice here that we've cut off the core, we've cut off the source region of Scandinavia, and now we're kind of sitting with that high, kind of just locking that cold air in place. Now, this is a kind of setup that you could see increasingly cold days and nights just simply based on the cold air trapped underneath that high. That has to be taken into consideration. So we could have a very cold setup through the course of next week, and it builds. And as we notice here, that high then starts to kind of pull back towards Greenland, and then you're starting to open the door to something colder. And the latest run of the GFS actually holds that ridge over the UK and Ireland, which is rather interesting. This is the thing. When you've got operational models, the chop and change with each run, we'll have to kind of look at the overall trend for the general consensus. But there is a lot of things going on. Keep it right here on my YouTube channel. Like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you hopefully again tomorrow with more weather updates. Thanks for watching. Have a good evening. Bye for now.